Before the Spanish conquest, Mexico was home to some of the most advanced civilizations in human history. The Aztecs, Maya, Olmecs, Zapotecs, Mixtecs, and countless smaller groups each thrived in unique ways. Their civilizations built majestic cities like Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza, developed written languages, and made groundbreaking advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture. This cultural richness is reflected in their DNA, which remains a vital part of the genetic makeup of Mexicans today. Indigenous Mexicans didn't just share a single genetic profile, they were incredibly diverse. Why? Geography played a massive role. The highlands of central Mexico, the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, and the deserts of the north created isolated groups that evolved distinct traits over thousands of years. For example, indigenous people from mountainous areas developed adaptations for high-altitude living, such as better oxygen utilization. These adaptations are still present in the DNA of their descendants. Today, indigenous ancestry remains a foundational part of Mexican DNA. On average, most Mexicans have about 60% indigenous heritage, though this varies greatly by region. In southern areas like Oaxaca or Chiapas, indigenous ancestry can be as high as 90%. What's even more fascinating is that these genes are often tied to specific indigenous groups, meaning a person's DNA can reveal exactly which civilization they're connected to. Language diversity further highlights this genetic richness. Mexico is home to over 60 indigenous languages, each representing a unique culture and, often, a distinct genetic lineage. These languages are more than words, they're living testaments to the resilience of Mexico's indigenous peoples, even after centuries of colonization and assimilation. Despite their remarkable contributions, indigenous communities have faced centuries of marginalization. However, in recent years, there's been a resurgence of pride in indigenous roots. Mexicans are increasingly celebrating their heritage, whether through language preservation, traditional crafts, or reconnecting with their ancestry. In essence, the indigenous roots of Mexico are the foundation of its genetic identity. They represent survival, innovation, and diversity. Mexican DNA is a living bridge to these ancient civilizations, carrying their legacy forward into the future. Without them, the story of Mexico and its people wouldn't exist. In 1519, when Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés arrived on the shores of Mexico, they weren't just carrying weapons and horses. They brought with them a genetic influence that would profoundly change the land forever. The Spanish conquest marked the beginning of mestizage, a blending of indigenous and European peoples that would shape the core of Mexican identity. But this merging of genes didn't happen peacefully. Colonization was brutal. Indigenous populations were devastated by violence, enslavement, and diseases like smallpox and measles. These diseases, to which the native populations had no immunity, wiped out millions within just a few decades. For those who survived, the Spanish imposed a new social order that included intermarriage, often forced, between European men and indigenous women. This genetic blending wasn't uniform. While most mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, emerged in central Mexico, some regions retained predominantly indigenous populations due to geographic isolation or resistance to colonization. Even today, genetic studies revealed that individuals in northern Mexico typically have a higher proportion of European DNA, while those in the south retain more indigenous ancestry. The influence of European genes is evident in many physical traits found across Mexico: lighter skin tones, different hair textures, and even susceptibility to certain diseases. But the genetic impact wasn't just physical. The Spanish brought with them cultural elements, language, religion, and social structures that altered the DNA of Mexico's identity just as much as its biology. Today, Mexican DNA is estimated to be about 30% European on average. However, this varies depending on the individual and region. Cities like Guadalajara and Monterrey often show higher levels of European ancestry, reflecting historical migration patterns and settlement by Spanish elites. The arrival of the Spanish not only altered the genetic makeup of Mexico, but also created a new identity that is uniquely Mexican. This mestizo identity is a fusion of the old and the new, the conquered and the conqueror. It's a reminder of the resilience of indigenous peoples and their ability to adapt and survive through one of the most tumultuous periods in their history. While colonization was a dark chapter, the mestizage it created gave birth to the complex and vibrant genetic tapestry that defines Mexico today. When people think of Mexico's genetic heritage, they often overlook the significant role of African ancestry. Yet, this influence is a key part of the story. During the colonial period, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, Spanish colonizers imported enslaved Africans to Mexico to work in mines, plantations, and as domestic servants. This forced migration added a vital layer to the country's genetic and cultural makeup, particularly in regions like Veracruz, Guerrero, and Oaxaca. The African presence in Mexico began with the Spanish conquest. Alongside Spanish soldiers came enslaved Africans, some of whom played pivotal roles in battles and colonization efforts. Over time, the number of enslaved Africans grew, with estimates suggesting that up to 200,000 were brought to Mexico during the colonial era. By the 17th century, some regions had large Afro-Mexican populations, forming communities that blended with indigenous and European groups. This blending created a unique genetic fingerprint. In areas like the Costa Chica of Guerrero and Oaxaca, people often carry a notable percentage of African ancestry, reflected in physical traits like darker skin, curly hair, and even certain genetic markers tied to resistance against diseases such as malaria. Interestingly, Afro-Mexican genes are not just visible, they're audible in the rhythms of traditional music and dance, such as the son Jaracho, which draws from African beats and instruments. However, African influence in Mexico isn't just historical, it's also cultural. African-descended communities contributed significantly to Mexican cuisine, introducing ingredients like plantains and techniques like frying. The beloved Mexican dish mole may have African roots, combining indigenous, Spanish, and African culinary traditions into one flavorful masterpiece. For centuries, Afro-Mexican communities were marginalized, their contributions overlooked in favor of a narrative centered on mestizage between Europeans and indigenous peoples. Only recently has Mexico begun to fully recognize its Afro-Mexican population, officially acknowledging them in the 2020 census for the first time. This recognition is a step towards celebrating their vital role in shaping the country. Today, African ancestry makes up a small but significant part of the average Mexican's DNA, about 5%, though higher in coastal regions. More than just genes, it's a testament to the resilience and contributions of those who endured unimaginable hardships yet left an indelible mark on Mexico's identity. Mexico's landscape is as diverse as its people. From towering mountains and vast deserts to lush rainforests and sprawling coastlines, the country's geography has profoundly influenced the genetic makeup of its population. The rugged terrain often created isolated communities, allowing unique genetic traits to flourish in specific regions over centuries. For example, central Mexico, dominated by the high-altitude Valley of Mexico, was home to civilizations like the Aztecs. People from this region developed genetic adaptations that helped them thrive in thinner air, such as improved oxygen efficiency. These traits remain in the DNA of their descendants today. In contrast, the Yucatan Peninsula, with its dense jungles, nurtured the Maya, whose genetic traits reflect adaptations to tropical environments. Northern Mexico, with its expansive deserts, has a population with a higher percentage of European ancestry. This is largely because Spanish settlers found the arid climate more similar to Spain's and established ranching communities there. Meanwhile, southern Mexico, rich in indigenous populations, retains some of the purest indigenous DNA, particularly in states like Oaxaca and Chiapas, where rugged mountains kept these groups relatively isolated from European influence. Coastal areas tell a different story. Ports like Veracruz on the Gulf Coast and Acapulco on the Pacific were entry points for African and Asian migrants during the colonial period. As a result, these regions often displayed a fascinating mix of indigenous, European, African, and Asian genes, making them some of the most genetically diverse areas in the country. Migration within Mexico also played a role. During the 20th century, industrialization drew millions of people from rural areas into urban centers like Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. These movements brought together previously isolated gene pools, creating an even more complex genetic mosaic in the country's major cities. In recent years, genetic studies have confirmed what geography suggests: Mexico's DNA is highly regional. A person's ancestry can often be pinpointed to a specific state or even a small town, thanks to the distinct genetic markers preserved by isolation and environmental adaptation. Ultimately, Mexico's geography shaped not only its history but also its DNA. It created pockets of uniqueness that reflect the land's incredible diversity. The result is a population whose genetic makeup mirrors the country's breathtaking landscapes, a true testament to the power of nature in shaping human identity. When thinking of Mexico's genetic heritage, Asia might not immediately come to mind. However, through centuries of trade and migration, Asian ancestry has quietly left its mark on Mexico's DNA. This influence stems primarily from the Manila galleons, Spanish trade ships that connected Asia, the Americas, and Europe from the 16th to the 19th centuries. The Manila galleons sailed between the Philippines and Mexico, carrying not only goods like silk, porcelain, and spices, but also people. Many Filipino and Chinese laborers and merchants arrived in Mexican ports like Acapulco. Some stayed permanently, blending into the local population. Over time, their genes became part of the Mexican genetic tapestry, particularly in coastal and urban areas. This Asian connection is more than just a footnote, it's visible in the DNA of many Mexicans today. Genetic studies have found traces of East and Southeast Asian ancestry in regions like Guerrero and Oaxaca, where the galleons made frequent stops. While the percentage of Asian DNA in the average Mexican genome is relatively small, typically under 1%, it's a fascinating reminder of Mexico's global connections even centuries ago. But the influence wasn't just genetic. Asian migrants contributed to Mexican culture in subtle but lasting ways. For example, culinary techniques like frying and ingredients such as rice became staples in Mexican cuisine through Asian influence. The popular dessert known as piloncillo, a type of caramelized sugar treat, may even have its roots in Filipino traditions. Asian laborers also brought their skills in agriculture, helping to develop crops like mangoes and tamarinds, now quintessentially associated with Mexican cuisine. Even cultural practices like certain forms of pottery and weaving reveal Asian-inspired techniques. Despite their contributions, the Asian presence in Mexico is often overlooked in mainstream narratives. However, scholars and geneticists are uncovering more about this connection, piecing together a story of migration and blending that enriches Mexico's identity. The Asian influence is a small but vital thread in the intricate fabric of Mexican DNA. It's a testament to how far-reaching global exchanges were, even in the colonial era. More importantly, it highlights the power of migration and cultural interaction in shaping a nation's identity, an influence that lingers in genes, traditions, and everyday life. Mexico's unique genetic composition doesn't just tell a story of history and migration, it also has profound implications for health. The blending of indigenous, European, African, and Asian genes has created a complex genetic profile that influences susceptibility to diseases, physical adaptations, and even responses to medication. One of the most significant health concerns tied to Mexican DNA is the prevalence of type 2 diabetes. Studies have shown that certain indigenous genetic markers make Mexicans more susceptible to this disease. These markers affect how the body processes glucose, a trait that may have been advantageous for survival in ancient times when food scarcity was common. However, in today's world of processed foods and sedentary lifestyles, it has become a major health challenge. Mexico has one of the highest diabetes rates in the world, and understanding the genetic factors behind this can help in designing more effective prevention and treatment strategies. Hypertension, or high blood pressure, is another condition influenced by Mexican genetics. African ancestry, particularly in coastal regions like Veracruz and Guerrero, is associated with higher risks for hypertension. This is partly due to genetic adaptations that helped African ancestors survive extreme environments but now pose health risks under modern dietary and lifestyle conditions. On the positive side, Mexican genetics also show fascinating adaptations that can benefit health. For example, indigenous groups living in high-altitude areas like Oaxaca have genes that enhance oxygen efficiency. These adaptations not only help with physical endurance but may also hold clues for treating conditions like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. Genetic diversity also plays a role in immune responses. Certain indigenous genes have been linked to higher resistance to viruses like influenza, while European genes brought vulnerabilities to diseases like smallpox, which devastated indigenous populations during colonization. Today, the interplay of these genes continues to affect how Mexicans respond to viral infections and vaccines. The study of Mexican DNA is contributing to personalized medicine, where treatments are tailored to an individual's genetic profile. Understanding these genetic nuances can help doctors predict who is at risk for certain diseases, how they might respond to medications, and what preventive measures could be most effective. Ultimately, Mexican DNA is not just a map of the past, it's a key to understanding and improving the health of future generations. The more we learn, the better equipped we'll be to address the unique health challenges and strengths of this vibrant population. Mexican DNA isn't just important for understanding the country's history, it's a goldmine for global genetics research. The extraordinary diversity of the Mexican genome offers insights into human evolution, migration patterns, and even the development of modern medicine. One of the most significant contributions is the study of ancient human migrations. Genetic analyses of indigenous Mexican populations have revealed critical clues about how humans first arrived in the Americas. These studies suggest that ancient populations crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into North America, eventually spreading southward into Mexico. By studying the genetic markers of these populations, researchers can trace the routes and timelines of these migrations, filling gaps in our understanding of early human history. The unique genetic blend in Mexico, indigenous, European, African, and Asian, also offers a rare opportunity to study how genes interact. For example, researchers have identified specific genetic variants in Mexicans that are associated with diseases like diabetes and obesity. Understanding these variants not only helps address health challenges in Mexico but also provides insights that can benefit populations worldwide facing similar issues. Mexican genetics have also played a role in understanding adaptation. Indigenous groups from high-altitude regions in Oaxaca and central Mexico have been studied for their remarkable ability to thrive in low-oxygen environments. These findings are helping scientists develop treatments for conditions like altitude sickness and respiratory illnesses. Another groundbreaking project is the Mexican Genome Diversity Project, which mapped the genetic diversity of Mexico's population. This research revealed just how regionally distinct Mexican DNA is, with clear genetic differences between northern, central, and southern populations. It also highlighted the resilience of indigenous genetic lineages, many of which have persisted despite centuries of colonization and assimilation. Additionally, Mexican DNA research has contributed to the 1,000 Genomes Project, an international initiative to map genetic variations across the globe. By including Mexican samples, scientists have been able to study how genetic diversity influences everything from disease susceptibility to drug efficacy. The global scientific community recognizes the value of Mexican DNA, not just for its complexity but for the stories it tells about humanity as a whole. From ancient migrations to modern health, Mexico's genetic diversity is a key piece of the puzzle in understanding our shared history and improving our collective future. Mexican DNA is more than just a scientific phenomenon, it's a living story of resilience, adaptation, and identity. Every strand of DNA carries a piece of Mexico's rich history, from the ancient civilizations that built pyramids to the people who resisted colonization and survived against all odds. This complex genetic heritage has become a source of pride for many Mexicans, shaping not only their physical traits but also their cultural and national identity. At its core, Mexican DNA is a mosaic. It reflects the country's indigenous roots, which remain deeply embedded in its culture. From the vibrant traditions of Dia de los Muertos to the languages still spoken in Oaxaca and Chiapas, indigenous heritage is a cornerstone of Mexican identity. This pride in ancestry is growing, with more Mexicans reconnecting with their indigenous roots and embracing the unique aspects of their heritage. The mestizo identity, born from the mixing of indigenous and European genes, is another defining element of Mexican culture. While mestizage was once seen as a way to erase indigenous identities, many now view it as a symbol of survival and innovation. It's a reminder that Mexico's strength lies in its ability to adapt and thrive in the face of adversity. Afro-Mexican communities, long overlooked, are also reclaiming their place in the national narrative. Their contributions to music, dance, cuisine, and art are being celebrated as vital parts of Mexico's culture. This recognition is helping to paint a more complete picture of what it means to be Mexican. Today, genetic research is giving Mexicans a new way to understand their identity. DNA tests allow people to explore their ancestry, revealing connections to regions, tribes, and even continents they may not have known about. These discoveries are sparking conversations about diversity, history, and what it means to belong. More than anything, Mexican DNA is a testament to the power of diversity. It's a living record of migration, blending, and survival. It shows that identity isn't static, it's constantly evolving, shaped by history, environment, and culture. For Mexicans, this genetic legacy is a source of pride, a reminder that their roots stretch deep and wide. It's proof that, in every sense, they are truly one of the world's most unique peoples.